Aleksandra, the tutor from AthenaStudies for taxation, and I'm going to be going through knowledge clip number 4 with y'all, which is about the analysis. So let's get started. Okay, so as always, I want to give you guys a general range of word count, and for this one, I would recommend about 1,000 to 1,200 words, and it's totally fine to be on the higher end of that. Your analysis is the biggest part of your essay, so you're going to need a lot of explanation, a lot of evidence, so that's why it is a pretty big chunk. It's pretty much a third of your overall word count requirement. So that's just putting it out there. And then the second thing I want to do, obviously, is just give you all a assignment reminder. So you had to pick one out of these 3 assignments. First one is about the publicly available taxes. The second one is about the solution to tax digital multinational companies. And the third one is about what is the best way to tax individuals earning money in the sharing economy. So one of these assignments is going to be the one that you use as inspiration for your central question. And now going into the analysis and what is the goal of the analysis. So this is where you're going to be arguing your points using relevant literature that helps you answer your central question. So your analysis is where you're presenting your opinion and your arguments. So all the sections before were very objective. There was no sort of support or refute. It was just stating pure facts. And in this case, we still are providing as much evidence as possible to support our arguments, but in this case, we are now going to decide for or against. So that's what the analysis is going to be for. So based on the criteria that you identified in your theoretical framework, you're now going to basically evaluate these criteria and conclude to what extent they are important and valid when you're evaluating your tax policy. So it depends obviously on the assignment that you chose, but the structure of the analysis or the content that you need to include is going to be the same. So quick note on this is that you need to discuss your criteria in depth and provide evidence both supporting and refuting your criteria. That's important. And you need to clearly show how you get from your criterion to your argument, whether it is support or refute. So I'm going to go into, firstly, the overall structure and content of your analysis. So you need to address all of your criteria. So in this case, it's highly personal, so I just put 1, 2, 3, and then, potentially number 4, potentially number 5. For my recommendation personally, I would recommend having 3 to 4 criteria just because you need to be able to explain them very in depth. So having too many, such as maybe 5 or more, is just, in my opinion, it's going to be too little word count to fully explain them. So in this case, I put a question mark by number 4 because it really just depends. But the overall structure is going to be, and content is going to be the same for each criterion. So for criterion number 1, just as an example, you need to order your criteria that you're going to address in order of importance. So in this case, this is going to be the most important criterion in evaluating your tax policy and central question. So this is where you're going to describe and evaluate the first criterion you previously introduced in your theoretical framework. So remember, in your theoretical framework, you introduced these criteria and you defined them, but that was it. Like, you didn't necessarily further evaluate them, further either support or refute to what extent they are valid when evaluating a tax policy. So now you're taking it a step further from your theoretical framework and going into more depth about each of the criteria that you already introduced. So for each criterion, you need to describe and briefly recap basically what this criterion means and why it's relevant in measuring whatever tax policy and its effectiveness, or why or why not it should be implemented. So in this case, you need to include evidence as to how this criterion applies directly to what your tax policy in your central question is exploring. So if you're talking about should, or to what extent should, corporations publicly disclose their tax information, and one of your criterion is maybe the cost of implementing such a tax policy, and you decide that's the most important consideration before implementing or supporting this tax policy, then you would put that as your first criterion and argue why it is a valid criteria for evaluating a tax policy, and then why it's not. So you're supposed to evaluate basically evidence from past literature that support the use of this criterion, the evidence from past literature refuting the use of this criterion, and then you need to obviously explain and include the criterion's level of importance comparing to the other criteria. So obviously you need to include, why is this the most important criterion? Why did you put it number one? And so in this case, at least for what I recommend, you start with the most important, but of course the structure is really up to you. As long as you explain which one is the most important and then the level of importance compared to the others, then it's going to be fine. But yeah, that's the main idea whenever you're talking about your criteria. So it's going to basically be the same for all of your criteria. So I'm not going to go through, 1, 2, 3, 4. But again, the structure is going to be the same per criterion you have. So you're always going to need to briefly recap what it means, have evidence supporting and refuting the extent to which this criterion is valid in terms of determining whether your tax policy is going to be successful or not, or whether it's should be implemented or should not. So remember that you should order it in terms of importance. That's what I would personally recommend, but of course it's up to you. So that's just my insight on that. And then we have the paragraph structure. So I just talked about the overall structure, so the overall criteria that you need to include in your analysis, but how do we logically flow your argument within the paragraphs? So again, for paragraph order, so section order, again, make sure you introduce your criteria in order of importance. That's again, I would really recommend that, but it's up to you. Which criteria are the most important in answering your central question? So for example, if you are evaluating the tax policy for publicly disclosing tax information, so you might have the first paragraph talking about the complexity, because that's the most important thing for evaluating the tax policy, and then maybe you think that the cost of implementing is the second most important. So it really is up to you. It's based on your assignment, your central question, and the criteria that you chose. So this part, it has a lot of room for, really what suits you best. But then the logical flow within each paragraph, again, you should introduce the criterion that you're going to evaluate. So that should be the beginning, it's going to be introducing your topic for that paragraph. And then per criterion, again, like I said, you need to introduce evidence supporting and refuting your view on the reason that you chose this criteria. So first, find evidence supporting this criterion, and then introduce counter-arguments against the criterion. And then once you've had counter-arguments shown in your writing, you need to refute why this counter-argument is flawed, and then conclude the paragraph with your final statement that the criterion is valid to the extent of whatever your central question is, or whatever tax policy you're talking about. So again, you need to include its weight of importance in comparison to the other criteria. So after you've shown evidence supporting, refuting, again, you need to say, therefore, based on all this evidence, as well as this criterion is the most important for evaluating, or is the most critical for evaluating, because it really depends on what your central question is, but it could determine whether or not the implementation of such a tax policy would be successful or not. So it really depends on what ranking of importance you put it in and why you chose that ranking, but you need to explain everything. And just a little note on this again, a condensed order of the paragraph structure is, again, you have your main section 1, which is about your criteria number 1, you list pros, you list cons, and then a short conclusion about the criterion and its importance. So that's the condensed version of the logical flow within each paragraph. You need to make sure that your argument is very clear and concise. So you need to move from point A to point B to point Z to point whatever, very logically. So this is what I had. Here's the evidence behind that. Therefore, I can make this statement because of this. And then in conclusion, like based on all of this, I can make this statement because I've already shown the evidence for it. So it needs to be very clear and logical how you got the evidence for your point, and then explain that evidence, and then conclude the evidence. So that's another thing I would recommend for your tutors as well. And yeah, I would check with your tutors as this also, it depends on them and their preferences because they're going to be the ones grading your assignment. But the last thing I'm going to do before I finish up is just show you my writing assignment and an example. So for me, I chose writing assignment 2, and as you can see, my analysis is very long. But at first, I just gave, again, some background into the issue that I'm going to be addressing, and then from there, I went into my criteria. So the first criteria that I chose basically was about the negative implications, of overtaxation, and then I went into the cooperation needed for the effective tax solution, the complexity. That was the main thing I was focusing on, the actual complexity of this tax policy. And then this was my first criterion that I was talking about, this giant paragraph, which I probably should have separated in two. But yeah, then I had my second criterion that I introduced. So my second criterion was talking about consumer created value. So this whole paragraph was me talking about evidence supporting this criterion and why we should use it. But then in this second paragraph, I talk about that this criterion has been rejected and maybe there's a better version of one. But then again, I refute this by basically saying that this criterion is justified and useful in terms of evaluating tax policy. And then I did the same thing for my third criterion, and then I refuted that criterion, and then at the end I again concluded that that this criterion is valid in terms of evaluating a tax policy. And then here's my last criterion. So like I said, this is how I structured it myself and what worked for me. Yours might be different, and again, just make sure that it's in order of how you want to value the criteria. So which ones do you think are the most important relating to your specific central question? So that is going to conclude basically this video about the analysis. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if y'all want one last video. But yeah, this is going to be it for the analysis, in-depth overview. And I'm going to link below the taxation writing assignment playlist if you guys want to look at past videos, and then also the slides to this video. But yeah, comment down below and let me know if you'd want a final short video about the conclusion and some extra tips for your writing assignment. But yeah, that's going to basically conclude the video, and thank y'all so much for watching again. I really hope that this is helpful. But yeah, good luck with your writing assignments. So bye.